Greetings everybody, Will Kelly here. Gosh, it's been a long time. It's been 5 years since my last video. And of course 5 years ago, it's 2025 now. So 5 years ago we were at the start of the whole COVID nightmare, if you want to call it that. It was certainly a disruption, if nothing else. So, and since then I've moved multiple times, 6 or 7 times, twice interstate. I moved back to Adelaide, my hometown, and then came back to Queensland once things started opening up again. I was involved in a YouTube channel called Elizabeth That Was, which chronicled the history of the hometown that I grew up in, and that was very soul satisfying in many ways and helped me to come to a lot of personal resolution and healing, I guess you would call it that. It was quite a personal journey and a bit of a labor of love. So that's called Elizabeth That Was, if you're interested in checking that out. But I warn you, it's very niche. It's basically just about the history of my hometown and my experiences, some of my experiences there, but mostly about the history of the town itself, which before 1955 didn't even exist. So when I was born in 1970, it was only 15 years old. Basically, the South Australian Housing Trust and the South Australian government bought something like 300 to 400 acres of farmland north of Adelaide and cleared it and just started building a city there that didn't exist before. So quite a unique period in South Australian history. However, that's not what this video is about, or even what this channel is about moving forward. And what this channel is about moving forward will reveal itself perhaps. But really, I thought I'd post a video about something that I was actually going through at the time that I posted my last video. But because I knew I was going through it, I didn't really talk about it because it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be objective about an experience you're still having without the benefit of hindsight or the completion of a cycle. And that cycle was what most of us would refer to as a midlife crisis, which I had actually been going through for a number of years. I'd say 2, maybe even 3 years before I even realized that that was what was happening. And once I did realize what was happening, and I'll get to when I realized it was happening, but once I realized what was happening and what I was going through, I decided that I was going to not have a crisis, but turn the midlife experience into a chrysalis. So that's really what this video is about. So it's really for older people, I guess, midlife and up, or perhaps some people approaching midlife, or people who are young and want to get ahead. So they're a little bit more prepared for when it happens, because there's, it's a bit like parenthood. There's no real decent textbook for dealing with such an experience that really is universal, or, it's right across the board in terms of the human experience. If you're fortunate enough to live long enough, you're going to arrive at that crossroads of the midlife experience. And when you get there, you will realize you have one of 2 options. You can go down the crisis road or the chrysalis road. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And hopefully, if you are experiencing this time of life, and hopefully this video will be helpful in some way, or perhaps even in hindsight brings some clarity or some epiphanies about what you experienced for yourself. So let's start by talking a little bit about how or when I realized I was in a midlife crisis. So around 2018, I had been for a number of years in basically a creative collaborative partnership with a friend of mine. So we had been making a lot of short films. I was sometimes in them, sometimes I was helping to produce them, sometimes it was all of the above. We were quite successful in getting quite a number of them into film festivals right around the world. So quite a number of them won awards and things like that. So from a creative point of view, it was quite a successful collaboration. But by the time 2018 came around, and we've been doing this for a couple of years, I was very much starting to feel disenchanted with the relationship that I had with this creative partner. And I was very much feeling taken for granted and not appreciated for the efforts that I was putting in. And I was beginning to make my feelings known. And it had gotten to the point by around 2018, it'd be around 2018, 2019, it had gotten to the point where we basically were only communicating online, so either messaging or via email, because to be in the same room was a little contentious. If we were on set making something, it was very professional, but personally speaking, we basically weren't speaking. So one day I decided to write him a very strongly worded email, and it was almost like a PowerPoint presentation of all my grievances and all the things that I felt was a slight towards me. And I sent it off, and as you might expect, I received a very strongly worded response. But several days before this, I had reached out to someone that I had grown up with. We went to primary school together, high school together. We had share house together in the 90s. But as I had started pursuing other things in life and evolving and growing in different ways that were very different to where and how we grew up, I basically became very lax in contacting. And I had let that relationship basically fade into my personal history. But one of the things that happened a couple of years before I realized I was in my midlife crisis was that I had started becoming very uncommonly sentimental and nostalgic about where I grew up and people from my past and experiences from my past. And I say uncommon because it's certainly, people who know me know it's not really in my nature to be sentimental. I'm very much a here and now, onward forward movement kind of guy. And when things have completed, when I have come to the end of a certain phase in my life, I'm very good at just honoring it and appreciating it, but then moving forward and not looking back. So I had been for a couple of years, up until 2018, been weirdly nostalgic and sentimental about my history. And I hadn't really thought about it too much, but I did feel it was a little odd. Also, what was happening was I was becoming increasingly agitated and intolerant of other people, which again, although I'm, quite known for being an incredibly ruthless individual when it comes to not having my time wasted or suffering fools, as they say, it's not in my nature to be, intolerant to that degree and just agitated and angry. I was becoming very, very angry, and that was not really like me, and I couldn't put my finger on that either. So fast forward back to this email that I had sent and to this creative partner of mine. A few days before that, I had reached out to this old school buddy of mine and, apologized for having not been in contact for a number of years and expressed my interest in reconnecting and catching up. And either the same day or the next day, it was very, very close of receiving this strongly worded reply from my email of accusation and finger pointing. I received a reply from this old school buddy of mine saying that they weren't interested in reconnecting with me and listing all the reasons why. And it was remarkable how similar this list of grievances that this person had with me was like the list that I had sent off to this other fella with all the list of grievances I felt that fella had perpetrated against me. And in that moment, I realized, wow, for every person that you're pointing the finger at, there's someone who thinks their life sucks just a little bit because you're in it. So that was a little humbling. And I also knew straight away that this wasn't a coincidence. The list was too similar. They were too close together in proximity of time. And I realized that this grievance that I had with my former creative partner, that was really just all about me. It was nothing to do with that person at all. This was about the relationship that I had with myself. And I also, for some reason, I don't know why, but it just dawned on me in that moment that I was actually having a midlife crisis, as they call it. And so I thought about that. I thought about how I had been increasingly getting angry for the 2 or 3 years prior to that, and overly sentimental and disenchanted and just disappointed in the way my life was going and the relationships that I had at that time. And it all built up to the realization that I was in my midlife crisis. And so the first thing that I did was I zoomed out from my own life and I looked at the human experience. And I realized straight away that if you're lucky enough to live long enough, you're going to hit midlife. In the same way, if you're lucky enough to reach young adulthood, you're going to have gone through the passage of puberty, of the teenage rebellion stage and adolescence. And so I realized that this is an experience that every human being has. Therefore, it's not personal. It's not personal to me. I've just lived long enough to hit a phase in the human experience where this happens to you. So I decided to not take it personally. And I also decided to assume that because this is woven into the human experience, that there must be wisdom in it, that life has decided to program us humans to have this kind of experience by the time you reach a certain stage in your life. And I think midlife, the actual crisis or chrysalis phase, happens at slightly different times. For mine, it started to set in at mid-40s. For others, it may be late 30s or maybe even early 50s. I don't know. But there are certain qualities to the experience that are universal, that we all experience once it starts to grab a hold. One of which I think it's very common for people to start getting overly sentimental and attached to their history, or a sense of feeling like they've missed opportunities or been somehow disappointed in the life that they've lived up until that point. And I think a lot of that has to do with life having programmed us in such a way as to, once you've hit that stage, to get you out of the external and more into an inner reflection phase of life. So for me, midlife is very much about taking a personal inventory of the life that you've led, the experiences you've had, the choices you've made, the beliefs and attitudes you've adopted from the time you become a young adult and moved out into the world to the time you've become an old young person, which is what you are by the time you reach midlife, and that midlife crisis point. For all intents and purposes, you're an old young man or an old young woman, and by the time you get through the midlife rite of passage, you come out of that experience a young old person. At least that's been my experience, and I can only talk about my experience, which is what I'm doing, in the hope that it's helpful to someone. It may prove very unhelpful to most, I don't know, but that's up for you to decide. But anyway, so I decided that I was going to have a chrysalis, not a crisis, and that I was going to, as best as I could with my limited experience of just being this one human, this one person with a very limited life experience, as every human's experience of life is very limited. It's, no matter what you experience, it's just a tiny fragment of the entire human experience, or the experience of life in general. So given my limited experience and my limited perspective and all of that, I decided that I was going to have a midlife chrysalis, meaning that I was going to listen to life and what I felt it was encouraging me to do, which was to take a personal inventory. So that's what I started to do, and I started to really look at the man I had been from a very young man up until becoming an old young man. The choices I had made, the people I had let down, the people I had helped, the opportunities that I had taken advantage of, the opportunities I had squandered, and basically looking at how well I felt I had done in living this life that I had been given, and really looking at what lessons had been learned along the way, and how that forged my character, and how that character had and continues to impact on the world around me and the people around me. People I had betrayed, whether it was myself or others. And as a human being, there are certain experiences as a human being that we are almost, you could say, doomed to experience, or destined to experience. There are certain lessons that every human being seems to learn. Everyone who lives long enough is going to be betrayed by someone. Everyone who lives long enough is going to betray someone in some way. Everyone who lives long enough is going to be victimized in some way, and is going to victimize someone else. We learn a lot about how we give our power away in exchange for some kind of security in the physical world. And we keep learning these lessons over and over again until we become strong enough within ourselves and develop enough self-esteem to stop doing those things. And self-esteem can only be developed through experiences, through making these mistakes, and through falling into these potholes. And we fall into more of those potholes, it would seem, during this, what I consider to be the second kind of phase in a person's life, which is between the young adult and the old young person phase. So in between, it's sandwiched between the child to adolescent and the young old person moving into elderdom. So this period of life in between, which is, roughly speaking, I would suspect somewhere between, the age of 20 to midlife, this seems to be the period in our life where we just make a lot of mistakes, and we consume a lot of experiences very much, I think, for the purpose of, once we get to midlife and we go into that inner personal inventory, we can start to weave those experiences together into some kind of narrative that we then get to integrate into personal wisdom that becomes something that then we can then contribute to the world around us as we enter what I refer to as young elderdom. God, I hope I'm explaining this as well. So for me, I feel like when it comes to that midlife period, most people go into a crisis, and I think most people go into a crisis because they don't understand what they're actually experiencing. So that experience of becoming a little bit more sentimental and reflective of one's history, I don't think is a mistake, but I don't think it's about us getting stuck in our history or confusing life for being better when we were young. I think we're programmed to become sentimental in that way to encourage us to take the personal inventory so that we can really examine the life that we've lived up until that point and examine things like our motives and our impact on the world around us and our impact on the world within us. Because each of us really live behind the eyes, not in front of it. We're all experiencing reality behind our own eyes. And for everybody, that's completely different. And for me, the midlife experience is really about getting back behind the eyes. So for the young adult to old young person time frame, that's really about being out in the world and having experiences and consuming experiences, relationships, disappointments, triumphs, right turns, wrong turns, all of those things. It's about consuming experience. And then in the external world, a much stronger emphasis on that life. And midlife is the beginning of the turning around and then looking back at oneself and returning behind the eyes and examining that personal inventory. And that's why I call it a chrysalis, because it doesn't last forever. But for me, it lasted quite a number of years when I decided that instead of going into a crisis and trying to somehow remain cool, not that I was ever cool, but instead of getting the sports car and finding a partner half my age, or whatever those cliches are, I decided that I wasn't going to try and remedy my predicament by finding solutions on the outer. I was going to go inward and stick with that process for as long as I needed to, and just trust that over time, just like when you enter puberty or adolescence and that rebellion stage as a teenager, that has a process. You're kind of in a chrysalis of a different kind at that period. That also is a period where you go inward and you try to work out who you are, independent of the tribe that has been raising you and independent of the tribes that you hang out with at school or whatever. You're trying to find your own personal stamp on things and your own individuality. And so you kind of go a bit more inner and you withdraw more from the tribes that you've been connected with, in an attempt to find your individuality. And so I think with midlife, it's kind of similar. It can take years, but like with adolescence, it has its own natural cycle. And if you're fortunate enough to live long enough to become a young adult, it's going to have played out, and you would have popped out the other side and become someone different than you were before you went into it. You're no longer a child, you're a young adult. And with midlife, you enter that phase and you're no longer an old young man. You pop out the other end and you're a young old man. hopefully with something to offer the world. So hopefully this makes sense. So I think if you get to that midlife period, if you're fortunate enough, if you're lucky enough, if you're blessed enough to live that long, and not everybody is, and the midlife period is a very scary, confusing time for some people, and sometimes it's laced with so much regret. And I think, I know with myself, I had several school friends who committed suicide during this period. And I think perhaps a lot of that has to do with just, as humans, we're very ignorant of our own human experience and the cycles that are inherent within the human experience. And so I guess if you hit midlife and you've made a lot of bad choices in your life, and you are biologically being wired to go inward and examine those things, and you couple that perhaps with a nasty inner critic and lots of regrets and things like that, I can see how that could be so painful that some people would just want to check out, sadly. And so, perhaps a lot of those things are integrated into our own ignorance as a species about our own human condition. But the midlife phase for me is as natural as the adolescent phase. And both of those phases, the onset of those phases signal the beginning of a rite of passage that is very much to do with determining who and what you are in the world behind the eyes, and how you're going to integrate that once that phase finishes with the world in front of your eyes. And so at the beginning of the midlife cycle, whether or not you decide to go down the midlife crisis route or the midlife chrysalis route will determine whether or not you emerge from that cycle a worm who continues to crawl on the ground, or a beautiful butterfly. I'm not sure if this metaphor works, but you know what I'm saying. The choice is yours, ultimately. You will either come out of that cycle, which has, again, as it could last for years, and if you surrender to it, you have no say in it. And I think it's going to be personal to each individual. For me, it lasted years, a bit like adolescence lasted for years. It definitely lasted for years. But I got to the point where I realized, I'm now north of midlife. I am north of that experience. So now hopefully I have something to contribute and something sensible to say about it. And I do know coming out of it, I feel more fulfilled and more grateful and more alive than I have ever felt in my life. If I'd gone down the crisis route and tried to fight the passage of time or fight the natural evolution of my personal human journey, being in this physical body which has its own evolution, its own predetermined, biologically wired experience, if I tried to fight that, I think that I would be a very unhappy, dissatisfied human being right now. And I think also my soul would have paid an awful price for that, because in my view, we are a soul borrowing a body, and for a very short period of time, for a nanosecond, really, in the history of humanity and history of the world, we're here for such a very, very short period of time. And human beings have been around for a long time. It is my belief that we are all extensions and expressions of life itself. And life, at the end of the day, is in charge. And life has programmed the human experience to have certain qualities about it, one of which is, as we've been talking about, the midlife experience. And if you can trust life, trust the wisdom of life, and know that the midlife experience isn't personal to you, it can't be personal to you because it happens to everybody that's fortunate enough to live long enough, then there's a lot of wisdom that you can glean from the experience, and there's a lot of comfort that you can take in knowing that it's not a mistake that you're experiencing that. It's not some anomaly. It's a natural part of your human process. And by surrendering to it, you don't become less of who you are. You will emerge from the experience more of who you are, much more of who you are. So I think I might leave this video here, and I will watch it before I post it, if I post it, and make sure I wasn't waffling too much. Anyway, I hope this video finds you well and happy and doing something in your day that you love to do. And until next time, peace out.